Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this, our March Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times, and as Yogi Berra said, sometimes it's deja vu all over again. I remember back in 1966, remember it very well, when many of us were rooting for Reagan to win the Republican primary for governor. The Democrat governor of California decided he wanted Mayor Christopher to be the nominee. Didn't want Rick Christopher because he thought Christopher was going to be the tougher opponent, and so Governor Brown did everything he could to be sure that Ronald Reagan was the nominee. Well, as some of you know, probably not all of you, because the newspapers didn't have it, and some of the networks didn't have it this morning. Helen listened to ABC for 45 minutes and they did announce it, but Bill Simon has won the Republican primary in California. And that is after Gray Davis spent a reported $8 million attacking Mayor Reardon, the quasi-Republican who now has endorsed Bill Simon. So it really is interesting times that we're in. I have to make another comment. I noticed that we had today, as we occasionally do here at these breakfasts, one of the things offered to you was grits. And coming from the Deep South, I have always been partial to grits, but I don't impose it upon you all every single month here, but I'm pleased that it happens every now and then. But as many of you know, I was for 9.5 years the executive director of the Council for National Policy, and they have 3 really fancy meetings each year at big resort hotels, and on Saturday mornings there is just a spectacular brunch laid out with virtually everything imaginable that you might wish for breakfast, all laid out there. And since there is enormous variety, and since a number of the members are Southerners, I always insisted that there be grits as one of the items on the big breakfast buffet. Well, when we're not in the Deep South, sometimes that is difficult, but generally speaking, it's well achieved. However, once CNP had a meeting in Montreal, and I told my staff, one way or another, I want grits at this hotel in Montreal. So Mary Margaret Hathaway talked with them months in advance. Grits, have to have it, no problem, no problem. Weeks in advance, days in advance, no problem, no problem. On the Thursday before the Saturday brunch, when we were there, the folks in the kitchen at this fabulous hotel in Montreal called Mary Margaret in and said, well, how do you prepare grits? And she says, well, people put in various things. You know, you put in salt and pepper, and sometimes people put cheese in the grits. And the guy from the caterer, the banquet manager says, well, to what consistency do you cook it? Kind of like oatmeal? And she said, yeah, kind of like oatmeal. And so when Saturday morning rolled around and the buffet was spread out, the members and guests of the Council for National Policy were offered 2 large heated trays of cheesy oatmeal. This year, the Leadership Institute has trained 418 students in 19 schools already. We've placed 13 conservative job seekers through our employment placement program, which is free to employers and prospective employees. And you have before you our current 2002 school schedule. I wish that you would take a little time to review the calendar and consider attending one or more of our programs. One other thing I wish to call to your attention, and that is this being late winter, this is the time each year when I offer for free a number of fruit trees and other trees that I have raised from seed. And I have a description of my offer here, and even an attached instructions for planting small trees. Some of them are at my house, some of them are growing in the little garden patio behind this building. One or two of them are at our intern house, and I do this every year, and they're free. And I guess I'd ask somebody to, do we have an intern who will stand up here and run around and give this offer? Victoria, you are not an intern. Jane, you're going to be on.
Well, I can take them to an intern.
No, Victoria will hand it. You're on next, Jane. Okay, so if you're interested in trees for yourselves or anybody else, there's little trees, but it's fun and something I do every year. And lots of people, lots of the most influential conservatives in the D.C. area have trees, some of them more than 20 years old that I've given them as seedlings, so they do well. Now, my pleasure is to introduce Jane Barnett, who will offer the invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Jane is Associate Director of Development here at the Institute, and she, among the many other great things she does for us, she organizes events for Institute donors, of which we had one last night at a restaurant up in Maryland on Wisconsin Avenue. Jane and I have known each other almost as long as Jane and Lou have known each other, but she knew Lou before she knew me, because when I first met her back in the late 1960s as a college undergraduate, she talked my ear off about what a wonderful fellow this Lou Barnett that I just had to meet from Southern California. And that relationship worked out very well because they have 7 kids. She began her event training in college, organizing fundraisers and rallies for her college Republican clubs, which I addressed at College of the Holy Name in Oakland 34 years ago. Before coming to the Institute, Jane served as program coordinator for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, where she successfully produced 50 events in 52 weeks, and special event coordinator for the California Republican Party, and she planned and executed victory parties and 4 Republican Party state conventions. Jane was also employed by 2 members of the California State Assembly, including Assemblyman Jim Rogan, whom many of us know, later in Congress. She introduced me once when I was in Sacramento to Jim Rogan, and I became a fan of his right then and there. And more recently, she managed a statewide campaign for a lieutenant governor candidate in California. So my pleasure to present to you the extraordinary and talented Jane Barnett.
Thank you, Morton. Whenever I'm asked to pray in public, I consider it an opportunity to share a prayer that has been in my family for 60 years. It was given to my dad as he was beginning his first year playing for the Washington Redskins. Although we've always considered it an athlete's prayer, many people that I've given it to have considered it a prayer for everyone. So I'd like to share it with you today. Dear God, help me to be a sport in this little game called life. I don't ask for any place in the lineup. Play me where you need me. I only ask for the stuff to give you 100% of what I've got. If all the hard drives come my way, I thank you for the compliment. Help me to remember that you won't let anything come that you and I can't handle together. And help me to take the bad breaks as part of the game. Help me to be thankful for them. And when, dear God, the game is finally over and I've been counted out, I ask for no lying complimentary memorials. I ask only to feel the clasp of your hand on my shoulder and to hear you say, "Good game, son. Good game." Bless us, O Lord, for these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. Please stand for the pledge. Please pledge with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Jane. Did I understand in that prayer that we talked about 60 years ago throwing hard drives at somebody? That was a really prescient prayer, throwing hard drives. Now I introduce to you Rich Westfall. He'll give us an update on our Center for Print and Broadcast Media's Graduate Development Department. He is director of the graduate development for the Institute at our Center for Print and Broadcast Media. And in this capacity, Rich provides career assistance to conservatives who aspire to work in the media, and he maintains our free placement service for media professionals, which is separate from our employment placement service. And he keeps up with the over 2,000 graduates of our media training programs. Prior to work here at the Institute, Rich launched and produced a television simulcast of the Mike Reagan talk show and booked guests for Paul Weyrich's daily program Direct Line. While studying broadcast technology and public affairs at Ashland University in Ohio, Rich worked as an on-air talent for radio station WQKT and did freelance reporting for the USA Radio Network. Rich Westfall.
Thank you, Morton. First, I want to say what a privilege it's been to work here for the last 3+ years. I can't think of any more important work than being involved in manufacturing conservative leaders for the next generation. Our future freedom depends on it, and Western civilization may depend on it. Prior to working at the Leadership Institute, I worked for a cable channel called National Empowerment Television. And the umbrella served to provide 24 hours of programming for conservatives who wanted to compete with the major networks. And although the channel doesn't exist anymore, there were several people involved in that project that moved on to other stations and around town who work behind the scenes now and in front of the cameras at many of the cable choices that we have today. In this job, I'm trying to figure out how conservatives could advance in the mainstream. And while it's not an easy task, I don't have producers at ABC News asking me for conservatives to work in their newsroom. It has been a nice challenge. In 1992, I attended the Leadership Institute's first broadcast journalism school. And there I didn't learn how to be conservatively biased, but rather to restore integrity to an important public institution. We learned how to be successful, to prepare ourselves for a career in broadcast journalism, and all sorts of techniques for advancing in this arena. And now, 10 years later, the Leadership Institute's trained over 2,000 people to be successful in journalism. And lately, the fruit's been paying off at the network level. Just this past weekend, we had Tina Kraus, a BJS graduate of 1993, tell us a little bit about her new job as a producer-editor at CBS News in New York. Also, Pedro Echeverria, a BJS grad of August 1995, is now the host of Washington Journal at C-SPAN. When Brian Lamb isn't involved in that, he's there, and I have an example of some of his work.
Good morning. It is Saturday, February the 9th, 2002. Welcome to Washington Journal. We have a 3-hour program for you today. We begin this morning's look at the papers with a look on a story that happened overnight in the Washington Times. Taliban foreign minister gives up. This article being written by Steve Vogel and Doug Struck. The foreign minister of the Taliban.
I don't know if you noticed, but it wasn't the Washington Times. He gave the Washington Times a little ad. It was actually the Washington Post. But actually, it was his first day at work, and he said he was a little bit nervous. So. But another graduate, Adam Housley, who'd been reporting from the Fox affiliate in Sacramento, had gotten a story on the O'Reilly factor, and Fox News Channel invited him to be a regular reporter for Fox News Channel. So shortly thereafter, he was in the Los Angeles Bureau and then flew out to Pakistan to cover the war on terrorism. And because of our growing relationships with Fox News Channel, including Rita Cosby, a senior correspondent, we've been able to provide a regular intern stream over there, and we just happen to have one of the interns with us this morning. So I've asked Sarah Tunstall to share a few things about her experience.
Good morning. First of all, thank you to Rich and Mr. Blackwell for the opportunity to come and present to you, I guess, live on the scene reporting from the internships provided by Leadership Institute. I attended the broadcast journalism school in December and graduated and was made aware of an opportunity through Rich Westfall and the Center for Print and Broadcast Media about an internship availability or possibility with Rita Cosby. I submitted a resume and a cover letter and was offered a position as her assistant. And that position has led to wonderful experiences and opportunities, not only to learn critical skills to make me a competitive possible employee in broadcast journalism, but I have a unique experience in that I commute to New York every weekend. Fox actually flies me to New York to work in the #1 market. So not only am I working for the youngest woman to ever be a political correspondent in the DC area, and I have the political experience 3 days out of every business week, but I'm also commuting to New York. And it's been a wonderful experience in the people that I've met. I actually met President Musharraf about a week ago and dealt very closely with his staff. General Qureshi actually asked me out for Valentine's Day. It was the best Valentine's Day of my life. I didn't go, but it was still very flattering, that no burqa, and I still had an exciting opportunity like that. And there have been other opportunities. I've met the president of Yugoslavia. I've met Tory Clark in the Pentagon. I've met Jim Wilkinson in the communications war room at the White House. And these aren't just opportunities where you're meeting these people, but they're opportunities that you're able to have a dialogue about getting the real inside story about what's happening in the news, what makes these people newsmakers, what makes the issues express themselves to the American public. And I'm excited to have had an opportunity to work through the Leadership Institute and to have had this opportunity coordinated through them. And it's my hope that this experience is going to yield dividends back to the Leadership Institute, that more doors will open for conservative Americans and more opportunities to learn for young people. So thank you very much for your time and for this opportunity to share with you this morning.
Thank you, Sarah. Her internship really does take the cake. There aren't very many internships that'll put you on a plane every weekend. Sarah is one of over 2,000 graduates that Leadership Institute has had the privilege of coming in contact with, and it really is because of your generous support. So on behalf of the Leadership Institute, I want to thank all of you and look forward to more success together in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich, and thank you, Sarah. And I know that many years in the future, you are going to be discussing with your grandchildren the opportunities that were afforded you through the Leadership Institute. One of them was a possible opportunity and an open door to a harem. So I know that will spice up your stories to your grandkids in the future. Now, let me introduce Chris Steele. Chris is the programs administrator at the Institute, and he oversees all aspects of the school's setup and faculty recruitment for many of our schools. And he's the founder and editor of the College Briefing, a weekly email digest that exposes leftists in the official college newspapers across the country in their own words. And if you get email and you aren't getting this and would like to see what Chris and Tom Crow are doing on a weekly basis, and you want to get your adrenaline up once a week, seeing what is being fed in the college students in the official campus newspapers, you ought to do this. It's a neat publication. In 1998, Chris worked at the office of Representative Dick Armey, where his emphasis was on the flat tax. And Chris founded in his own town, involving local politics, the Rutherford Junior Council, an organization dedicating to get the youth involved in politics. Chris is a graduate of Rutgers University with degrees in political science and history. Chris Steele, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Morton. As Morton did say, I am editor of the College Briefing, and I do have no problem whatsoever exposing what Rutgers University has to say, so we are fair. It's my privilege to introduce to you today our speaker, Stephen Moore. In Economics in One Lesson, Henry Hazlitt wrote that the bad economist sees only what immediately strikes the eye. The good economist also looks beyond. The bad economist sees only the direct consequences of a proposed course. The good economist also looks at the longer and indirect consequences. It's clear that Hazlitt could have been writing about our speaker today, Stephen Moore. He's currently the president of the Club for Growth and a contributing editor of National Review. He previously was Cato Institute's Director of Fiscal Policy. He served as senior economist of the Joint Economic Committee, where he advised Congressman Dick Armey, Chairman Dick Armey, on the budget, taxes, and was an architect of the Army flat tax. He's also co-author of the book It's Getting Better All the Time, 100 Greatest Trends of the Past 100 Years, and the author of Government, America's #1 Growth Industry. Please welcome Stephen Moore.
Thank you. That's a very nice introduction, Chris, and thank you, Morton, for inviting me. First, let me just salute all of you who are supporters and donors to the Leadership Institute, as I am. I think it's truly one of the outstanding programs in Washington to train young conservatives, and I've seen them come through the system over the years. So I'm just really impressed with the work that you all do at the Leadership Institute, and I'm a big fan of the programs. And as I said, all the time I run across young conservatives who are working not just in the media, but on Capitol Hill or in the administration or public relations firms that came through the Leadership Institute. So it's really needed, and I thank you all for supporting it. Morton asked me to talk a little bit about what's going on with the economy and then tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and a little bit about politics and what we're doing at the Club for Growth. And so let me start by saying that Morton mentioned the 1966 governor's race with Reagan, and it reminded me that I was privileged enough about 2 or 3 weeks ago to be out at the Reagan Library for, how many of you have been out to Simi Valley to see the Reagan Library? It's a wonderful experience, and next time you're in Southern California, I'd really urge you to take a day and go out to Simi Valley and see it. It's a great facility, but this is a conference that every year the Investors Business Daily puts on for it, and they do it on Reagan's birthday every year. And so there were about 400 people there this year, and it was myself and Larry Kudlow and a bunch of other economists, and Art Laffer was there, and Art told this great story about Reagan that I think is just so relevant to what's happening today. And as you all know, Art Laffer was Reagan's chief economic advisor through the years, and was the one who turned Reagan on to the whole supply-side economics idea. And so Art tells the story that, as you all know, when Reagan was first elected, when he came to Washington, there was a lot of people were mystified about what this new president was going to do. And as you know, this was a time very similar today of great both economic crisis and foreign policy crisis, with the height and peak of the Cold War going on. And so Reagan comes into his first cabinet meeting in the West Wing, and assembled there are, of course, all these luminaries, people like George Shultz and Cap Weinberger and Ed Meese and all of these great Reaganites, but they're all kind of waiting for their marching orders from Reagan. And so he comes into the room and he sits down, and there's a long silence, and you can hear, according to Art, a pin drop in the room. And finally, President Reagan stands up and he says, "Gentlemen," he says, "I hate taxes, I hate inflation, and I hate Russians. Do something about it." And then he walks out of the room. And this is just one of my favorite Reagan stories, because this kind of clarity of thinking is exactly what we need today. This is really what made Reagan such a great president. Those were the three things he wanted to do. Of course, when the decade was over, there wasn't any inflation left. Taxes had been cut, and the Russians had been defeated. One of the things that concerns me about this, in fact, we had a discussion at this conference about how we would rate the Bush presidency after a year, and it was interesting because all of us basically sort of said the same thing, that we would give President Bush probably an A+ in terms of his handling of the foreign policy and the terrorism crisis and so forth, but probably only about a C+ in terms of his handling of the economy. And that's a problem because, unfortunately, Bill Clinton is right that when it comes to elections, it is the economy, stupid. And we do, I think one of the messages I'd like to transmit to you this morning is we do need to push President Bush to promote much more of a tax cut, anti-big government agenda when it comes to domestic policies. Now, let me say that when it comes to recessions, as we're in right now, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I mean, some people are very optimistic about what we're going to see in terms of growth in the second half of this year. I tend to be somewhat more cautious about where the economy is headed, partly because the world economy is so fragile right now, and it is a global economy right now. But the question is, where did this recession come from? And we have been in a recession. A recession, you all know, is 2 straight quarters of negative economic growth. And last year, Larry Kudlow, who is a pal of mine, and we do a lot of work together. You all probably know Larry has his own TV show now on CNBC that if you haven't seen, I highly recommend it. It's a good show on at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. But anyway, about 3 or 4 months ago, Larry and I did this project where we were looking at the GDP numbers, the official numbers for what's happening with the economy. And we were puzzled, both of us, by the fact that the GDP numbers were showing slight economic growth, not major economic growth, but maybe 1% growth in the first and second quarters of 2001. And this mystified us because everywhere we'd been, when we talked to businessmen, we'd ask them, how's business? They'd say it's lousy. They'd say we're down 10 or 20% or 30% from last year. And so, it was very rare that we talked to a businessman who said that things were going well, at least last year. And so we sort of scratched our heads and said, if all these businessmen are saying business is down, how can the official GDP number be reflecting increased economic growth? And so what we did was we decided to go to the GDP numbers and try to investigate what was it in the economy that was growing, because clearly manufacturing wasn't growing and services weren't growing and so on. And it was very interesting. We found that one component of GDP had experienced enormous growth in 2001. And I wonder if you can guess what component of GDP was growing in 2001.
Yeah.
Government, exactly. People forget that, government is 33% of our economy right now. So when you're talking about the GDP, and unfortunately, we really do the GDP numbers wrong. Milton Friedman has talked a lot about this. When the government gets bigger, we count that as an increase in GDP. But Milton Friedman says we should call an increase in the government a decrease in the GDP because that actually makes the private sector economy shrink. But in any event, what we found is that in the first 3 quarters, this is prior to September 11th, that in the first 3 quarters of 2001, the economy had actually, what we did was we created what we called the private sector GDP, which of course is GDP minus government. You follow the calculation. And what we found was that private sector GDP had fallen by -1% in the first 3 quarters, and government spending had grown by almost 4% over that period. So that explains why we've seen this increase in GDP, and we think that, in fact, things have been worse than these official numbers calculate. Well, what caused this recession? I think there's a lot of confusion about that. And by the way, I'm a big believer that there's no such thing as a kind of natural business cycle. That is to say, it's not as if these expansions like we had in the late 1990s die of old age. I can point you, any recession that we've had over the last century, I can point to you the mistake that we made in government policy, whether it was monetary policy or trade policy or fiscal policy, that caused that recession. That is to say, governments kill expansions. It's not as if expansions die of old age. And this current recession that hopefully we're coming out of is no different from what we saw in the 1970s and the recession that we had in the Great Depression in the 1930s and so on. Let me just take a minute and tell you the 2 factors that are the 2 policy mistakes that were made that caused this economic slowdown. And hopefully we've made corrections in both of these. The first was one with respect to monetary policy. Now, I'm one who happens to believe that over the course of the last decade, under Alan Greenspan, we've had an exceptionally strong monetary policy. what you want with a good monetary policy is price stability. And Reagan believed quite correctly, and this is one of the reasons he was such a successful president, that he was going to make the dollar as good as gold again. And that's exactly what happened. We sweated inflation out of the system. I remember when I graduated from college, I don't know how many of you all remember this, but remember around 1979, 1980. Remember when mortgage interest rates reached a high of 20%? You know, nobody, it just killed the housing market and so on. We had inflation rates of 11 and 12% back then. Well, thanks to the Reaganomics policies of restoring soundness to the currency, we sweated inflation out of the system and achieved price stability. And Greenspan was exceptionally strong in keeping the dollar strong. The problem is that a mistake was made, and let me just take a minute to explain what happened. Think back at late 1999, sort of the period June 1999 through December 1999. What were Americans thinking about and worrying about in late 1999? Who said that? Y2K, exactly. It seems like 100 years ago, right, that we were worried about Y2K, but this was something that Americans were really dramatically concerned about. And you can see it in terms of what happened was that Americans were so afraid that the computer systems were going to crash around the country that people literally went to their banks and they started hoarding dollars. They took money out of their savings accounts, their IRAs, their 401k plans, and they started literally putting money under their mattresses and in their drawers and so on, because they thought, look, January 1, 2001 is going to come along, the banking system is going to collapse, and I'm not going to be able to get my money out. So there's essentially a run on the dollar in late 1999. Now, when you have that kind of demand for dollars, it needs to be accommodated, and Greenspan quite correctly accommodated that by lowering interest rates so that there were more dollars flowing out there. Well, January 1, 2000 comes along, and we all learned that this was just a big hoax perpetrated by accountants and lawyers and so on, this Y2K thing. Now, all of a sudden, you have all of this excess dollar liquidity out there, right? Because people have been hoarding all these dollars. Now the crisis is over, and as you all know from basic economics, and I was so pleased, Chris, that you mentioned that book, Economics in One Lesson, which really is a classic. And if people would just read that one book, they'd learn more economics than they would from 4 years training at the People's Republic in Cambridge and Harvard. But in any case, what happened was that in 2000, after January 1, 2000, Greenspan made a horrendous monetary mistake where he essentially started raising interest rates to take this excess liquidity out of the market because inflation is too many dollars producing too few goods. We had something like 8 interest rate increases that year, and it just sucked the oxygen out of this high-tech new age economy. And when you did that, you saw all sorts of companies failing and so on. It caused the market to fall, and it was a very dramatic mistake. And Greenspan, I think it's a real blot on Greenspan's record, because I think this was largely a recession caused by a significant monetary mistake. And Greenspan was far too late in terms of recognizing that we were in a period of deflation. And this is one of the points I'd like to make to you all this morning, is that just as inflation was a big problem that we had in the 1970s, where prices were rising so dramatically, deflation can have the same kind of negative effect. And I do believe that over the last year and a half or so, we have been in a fairly serious deflationary environment in the United States. And the best way to look at that is, I believe the best way to measure prices is not to look at the consumer price index, but to look at what's happening with commodity prices. You look just at for example, the Economist magazine puts out an index of 30 commodities, and they look at what happens with the change in the prices of those. So that includes everything from corn to wheat to copper to silver and so on. And you examine what's happening with the price of these commodities over time to get an indication of what's happening with prices. Well, over the last 2 years, commodity prices have fallen by about 35 to 40%. Folks, that is serious deflation. If you want to talk, in fact, I was out in South Dakota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I don't know if you've ever been there, Morton, but it's, I went there in February. So anyways, all these farmers were complaining about, how horrible conditions are, and they were blaming, free trade and all these things. And I said, look, this is not, if you really want to blame the person who's causing farm prices to fall, it's Alan Greenspan because of this very tight monetary policy. Anyway, I think that's been a significant problem. We've had 10 interest rate increases over the last year. I think they've made a difference, and I'm hopeful that starting sometime in a couple of months that those interest rate the interest rate cuts are going to start to have an impact in terms of reviving the economy. Now, the other big problem that happened was taxes. And I was giving a presentation about 3 weeks ago at the Republican retreat that they had for the congressmen out in Williamsburg. And I was giving the same presentation, and I talked about taxes, and I had a chart. I didn't bring it this morning, but I'll describe it to you. What it shows is that it shows just federal taxes as a percent of GDP over the last 10 years. And it tells a very interesting story. That is to say that taxes as a percent of GDP have gone up every year since 1993. In 1993, now this is of course over the Clinton presidency, but in 1993 the federal tax burden was about 17.5% to 18% of GDP, which has been the average roughly over the post-World War II period. It's gone up by about a half a percentage point to a percentage point per year for 6 years. So that now we're at a situation where the federal tax burden as a share of GDP is closing in on 21%. Now that maybe doesn't mean a lot to you, that number 21%, but let me state it this way. That is the highest single federal tax burden we have had since 1946. Which was, of course, the end of World War II. If you look at, even with the Bush tax cut, over the next 5 to 6 years, the Congressional Budget Office is predicting that taxes will be about 19.5% of GDP, which will be the highest 5-year period in American history. Now look, you can't take 3 to 4% more of GDP out of the economy and take it in taxes and not expect that to have an anchoring effect on the economy. And I think that's clearly what's happened. That tax burden is starting to really bite. Now, the interesting thing was that when I presented this data to a lot of the Republican lawmakers, Denny Hastert, raised his hand. He was shocked by this. Steve, how can this be? Since 1995, we Republicans have been in controlled Congress, and we haven't raised taxes at all. How can the tax burden be going up every year? What I had to explain to these folks, and it's a really important kind of economics lesson, that when you have a graduated income tax structure, as we do now, when your incomes rise, as was happening in the late 1990s, because it was a very prosperous period, guess what? Your tax burden goes up faster than your income does. Because let's take a worker who's earning $40,000 a year. And let's say over that 5-year period, 1995 to 2000, his income goes up from $40,000 to $50,000. This happened with a lot of workers because it was a time when incomes were rising. Guess what? That additional $10,000 of income that worker is making isn't being taxed at 10 or 15%. It's being taxed at 28 or 31%. So people are being pushed into these higher tax brackets. We call it real income bracket creep. Now, the solution to this, of course, is something that you worked on, Chris, which is a flat tax. Because if you have a flat tax system with a one-rate system of taxes, does that mean I need to stop? Okay. If you have this kind of flat rate income tax system, as Chris worked on, and I was so cheered to see that you worked for Dick Armey on that, because I was actually the one who went to Dick Armey about 8 years ago and said, Dick, you got to do a flat tax, and we really rode this thing, and it's a great plan. But if you had a flat tax system, you follow me? That if you only have one rate, then if you make an extra $10,000 in income, your average tax burden will be the same. And one of the problems with a progressive income tax structure is exactly what happened in the late 1990s, which is that Congress didn't have to legislate any tax increases. They get automatic tax increases every year because people are being pushed into these higher tax brackets. So I think those are the two real problems that we face right now. Now, we've got to do something. I think the bottom line in terms of policy is, the implication of this is we need to do a much bigger tax cut than even the one that George Bush passed last year. If you look at the numbers, we should have done a tax cut about 2 to 3 times larger than the one we passed if we want to bring the tax burden down to about 18% of GDP, which is about the average. So when people like Tom Daschle and Ted Kennedy talk about this enormous tax cut that we passed, it's nonsensical. This tax cut was about 1/3 of the size of for example, the Reagan tax cut, and about 1/3 of the size of the Kennedy tax cut in the early 1960s. We need to do something about capital gains. We ought to cut the capital gains tax in half. I was on one of the Fox shows a few nights ago with who's that woman who was Clinton's chief economist, Laura Tyson, not long ago, and she was, we can't cut the capital gains tax. This is going to be a tax cut for rich people and so on. And I said, look, Laura, we just cut the capital gains tax in 1997 from 28% to 20%. And guess what do you think happened with capital gains tax revenues over the last 5 years? They've doubled. They've doubled. We cut the tax rate by almost 20%, and we got a doubling of the capital gains tax revenue. So that's a great example of the Laffer curve in action, a real life example. We ought to do away with the death tax immediately. We ought to take that Bush tax cut, and this is something I was urging the White House to do right after September 11th. Just, if you want an economic stimulus plan, just take the Bush tax plan that passed in May and make it effective, September 11, 2001. We don't need a tax cut in 2005 and 6 and 7. We need a tax cut right now. And the problem I have with the Bush tax cut is 75% of that tax cut doesn't even take place until 2005, which is why when Tom Daschle and Dick Gephardt and Ted Kennedy keep saying, oh, the reason we've had this recession, this higher deficit is because of the tax cut. What tax cut? There hasn't been a tax cut. All we've gotten so far is this, measly little $300 tax rebate. So I think that's what needs to be done on tax policy. On the death tax, I'm just a big believer that Steve Forbes had the message exactly right on this, that we ought to have a policy in this country that says no taxation without respiration. I think he's exactly right on that. Let me just take, I'm just going to stop there and talking about the tax issue and just spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about the Club for Growth and what we do, because I was told that some of you wanted to hear about what it is, why we started this group, and why we're giving so much heartburn to the Republican establishment with this organization. And, it starts with there's a friend of mine named Fred Smith, not the Fred Smith who runs Federal Express, but Fred Smith who runs a group called the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who's a real institution in this town. And Fred always asks this question that we as conservatives ought to ask every day, which is, if we're so smart, why aren't we winning? If we're so smart, why aren't we winning? And it is true we're smarter than the other team. We have better ideas than they are, but a lot of times we're not winning. A lot of times it's the left that's advancing the ball, not us. And I've always thought, that the reason that we're not winning is not because we don't have superior ideas, because we do, but because the game of politics is played so much better by the left than it is us. Partly because that's their lives. And it's not just the lives of the left. Politics is also the livelihoods of the left. And so they live and breathe politics. And so we decided we wanted to sort of find out how it is that, for example, the left is so successful at winning elections with left-wing politicians, and if we could take a page out of their book. And that's where we came up with this idea of the Club for Growth. And it's really started with a friend of mine named Paul Ryan. Do any know Congressman Paul Ryan from Wisconsin? He's a real rising star in the House. I think he's going to be, we're grooming him to be president someday. He's a young guy. He's only 32 years old. He's just used to work for Bill Bennett at Empower America and did some work with Jack Kemp and went through Heritage. And I think he probably, for all I know, he probably went through your program, Morton. But really great guy. Ran for Congress in 1998, I believe, was his first time. He was running in a swing district, and myself and a bunch of others who had known Paul over the years helped raise money for him. And I remember, I'll never forget this conversation. I called him in mid-October before this election in November of '98, and I said, Paul, how is it going out there? He said, well, it's going well. The only problem I'm facing right now is that my opponent, I forget what this woman's name was, she just got put on this list of this group called Emily's List. How many of you all have heard of Emily's List? Most of you. I had never heard of Emily's List before, and I said, what? And Paul said, in Emily's List, people have raised $300,000 for this woman in 3 weeks. Now, folks, in a congressional race, $300,000 is a lot of money, and to raise that in 3 weeks is a kind of an awesome achievement. So, by the way, the happy end of that story is that Paul did win that race, 58-42, and is now, as I said, a star. But I've always thought, I thought about how can we do, if the left can raise that kind of money for a candidate, why can't we? And then we did a lot of investigating about how Emily's List works. It's a bundling operation where under this new environment where you can only give $1,000 per, any individual can only give $1,000 to a candidate, where a PAC can only give $5,000 to a candidate. If you really want to be a decisive influence in a race, you're going to have to raise $200,000 or so in an election, and that's where we got into this idea of bundling. So what we do is we have about 5,000 members around the country. We pick, we're about economic issues like tax cuts and Social Security privatization and so on, and we try to pick those candidates who, number one, are in tight races where we think our members' money can make a really decisive impact in these races. So we don't pick sure winners and we don't pick sure losers. It's tended to be a very successful formula. We've had 2000 was our first go around with this, and we helped put 10 new, really outstanding kind of Reaganite tax cutting hard chargers in the Congress, and we hope to add about another 10 or 15 this election cycle. Now, the one thing that we do that is somewhat controversial, but I think is really critical to the club's mission, is we want to be a kind of conservative conscience to the party. And to be that kind of conservative conscience, you have to hold a bit of a hammer over these guys' heads. And so one of the things that we did, I'll tell this final story, and then I know I probably exceeded my time, but let me just tell you this quick story, because it is an indication of how we can win in politics. And that is to say that when we first started this organization, literally a month after we opened our doors, we announced that we were going to back 5 candidates for Congress, the first 5 that we were going to start with. And one of those candidates was a gentleman by the name of Scott Garrett. Now, Scott Garrett was running against an incumbent Republican named Marge Rockema. Now, Marge had been in Congress for about 20 years. She was in line to be the Banking Committee chairman. And she had an awful voting record. She'd been kind of a claw in the throat of conservatives for her entire tenure in Congress. Well, I had sort of leaked this story to Bob Novak, who loves to stir up trouble himself, and I had told Bob that we were going to raise $2 million to defeat Marge Rockema. Now, that was a huge exaggeration. I said up to $2 million, and as you know, $200,000 is up to $2 million. And so Rockema reads this story, and she just goes ballistic. And so she, bless her heart, I'll never forget this. One day I walk into my office. I've got a call from the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, NBC, ABC, every major network, every major newspaper. What are you doing to poor old Marge Rockema? She had held a press conference in front of the Capitol denouncing the Club for Growth. And she did this week after week after week for 3 straight months. She probably gave us $1 million worth of free publicity. And it was really just a great story, because the more she complained about this group, the Club for Growth, and da-da-da, we were getting people all over the country calling us, I want to contribute to any group that's trying to take out Marge Rockema. Well, by the end of the race, she had, just to show you the sort of the power of incumbency, we had raised about $300,000 for this guy, Scott Garrett, which is a lot of money in a Republican primary. She raised $1.2 million. She got money from every special interest lobby in Washington and so on. By the end of the race, it was really quite funny, too, because she was calling herself a Reagan Republican. She said, why are they doing this? I love Reagan and I love tax cuts and so on. She'd never voted for a tax cut before, but she actually, her voting behavior changed dramatically. Anyway, the end of the story is that we almost beat her. We came within about 1,000 votes of defeating her. And I remember the next day I went to my office, and literally people were calling me saying, are you guys going to have to go out of business now? You've invested so much. And we thought, my God, we probably are going to have to. Everyone knows us as the group who took on Marge Rockema, and we failed. And the funny thing about that whole thing is that although we thought by losing to her that it was just this big failure, it was really the most important thing we did, because what we're finding now is that all of these moderates, and we want to try to hold the moderates in line, because my big idea is that one of the reasons we don't lose these key votes is not because of Dick Gephardt or Tom Daschle. It's because of people like Fred Upton and Chris Shays and so on that always defect to the other side. And so what has happened is that now every time there's a key vote, what we do is just send a friendly letter out to the Fred Uptons and the Chris Shays of the world, just saying, anybody who votes against, for example, the Bush tax cut, we are going to run a primary challenger against them. Well, these guys, the good thing about moderate Republicans is they're cowards, and so they tend to be very, they will, they call me up, Steve, I'm going to vote for this thing, I promise you, and so on. So anyways, I think it is a kind of important lesson about how sometimes we need to, and by the way, this is something that, the Republican Congressional Committee, the Senatorial Committee, they hate this. We have a very adversarial relationship with them. Even though we've helped put a lot of conservative Republicans in Congress, they believe that this 11th commandment, by the way, Warren, where did this idea of this Reagan 11th commandment of thou shalt not take on incumbent Republicans come from. I don't believe Reagan ever believed that. I mean, after all, Reagan took on Jerry Ford in 1976, who was an incumbent. So anyway, we keep getting this Reagan 11th commandment thrown at us. But it is important not just to put more conservatives in, but to try to hold these guys' feet to the fire, I think by trying to take on some of the incumbents to keep them honest. So anyway, thank you again for inviting me. If we have time, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
We do have time for some questions, and we'll start with Kitty Smith.
Oh, I just wanted to say it's thou shalt not speak ill of thy fellow Republicans, not thou.
Ah, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Sir?
There seems to be some fracturing within the labor movement. Do you think that's an opportunity, or does that just further empower the moderate Republicans?
You mean organized labor?
Yeah.
One of the things that's been really just a political development that's occurred in the last 20 years that's been really problematic, I think, for the country is that the Democratic Party has become a completely owned subsidiary of organized labor, the feminists, and the trial lawyers. And this means that the Democrats just cannot defect from what organized labor wants when it comes to the feminist agenda, the trial lawyer agenda, and the big labor agenda. And that's problematic because, organized labor has moved very dramatically to the left. It used to not be as dramatically left-wing as it is today. In fact, AFL-CIO was one of the major anti-communist organizations back in the 1960s and 1970s. So that makes it very different. I mean, what that means is that the whole idea of a conservative Democrat doesn't really exist anymore. When you think about it, name a conservative Democrat that we have left other than Zell Miller. And Zell Miller, could very easily become a Republican. Now, part of that is because those old conservative Democrats have become Republicans, but part of it is because of this vice grip that, all of the money for Democrats comes from trial lawyers, unions, and feminists. And groups like Emily's List. So when you ask the question about whether the organized labor is fracturing, there are some issues where you see that happening. The best example is this science fiction of global warming, where it pits two elements of the left coalition, the radical environmentalists versus the unionized workers whose jobs are threatened by this radical environmental agenda, especially when it comes to issues like global warming. I've tended to find, I think it might be a little bit of wishful thinking on our part to think that this is going to divide labor or the left. The left is just a big Gordian knot. It really is. And you very seldom find occasions when they will defect. They all basically will toe the line on the other person's agenda, whether it's environmentalism or, whatever it is. So I don't think that we're likely to see organized labor fracturing too much, especially because the leadership is so liberal right now, unfortunately.
Question over here, Jim.
Steve, I want to get your take on President Bush, because this is the big talk on the BBC this morning that European Union, some of these other countries are really mad because he's sticking the tariffs now on the steel imports. I wanted to get your take on that.
This was an awful decision by the president because of all the things you don't want to impose tariffs on. You don't want to impose tariffs on something like steel, because steel is an input in everything that we produce in this country when you think about it. And so if we're trying to improve our trade balance, for example, imposing duties on steel will put all of our other manufacturers at a significant disadvantage, because it now means that our manufacturers are going to have to build things with steel that's cost 20% more expensive than the Japanese and the Koreans and so on. So it's, I think, a harebrained idea. I talked to the White House many times on this, and they understood the economics of this. In fact, I had a quote in the Washington Post this morning about this, that the White House understood that this was bad economics. They just made a political calculation that they had to do this for Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and so on, the steel states. But I think that it's a real dangerous situation, because you're seeing, just as you're pointing out, Jim, that now all of these other countries, we can't sort of play the holier-than-thou card anymore on trade, because now the Belgians and the French, now the French farmers are going to see we're going to raise our subsidies on farm prices and so on. I'm just a big believer that in a true free trade regime, the U.S. we're the low-cost producer in so many areas, not in things like steel, but we are the low-cost producer in every exciting new 21st century industry, whether you're talking about semiconductors or software or pharmaceuticals or electronics or financial services. So I'm just a big believer, Jim, that and in fact, those types of industries that I just mentioned are the kinds of industries that do supply the very high-paying jobs. So I was very discouraged by that. But, Reagan, who was a free trader too, I believe George W. Bush in his heart is a free trader. He imposed, remember in the early 80s, he imposed these what were they? The import duties on Japanese automobiles and so on. So hopefully this will not be the beginning of a pattern, because, when you go back to what I was talking about earlier about things that can really disrupt a prosperity. See, I'm a big believer there are four prosperity killers. Just say this real quickly. If you look throughout history, four things have killed periods of American prosperity. Number one, tax increases. Tax increases are almost the surest way to add to prosperity. Number two, bad monetary policy, either inflationary, deflationary monetary policy. Number three is protectionism and trade wars. The Great Depression was largely caused by this huge trade war that happened, where if you look at what happened to global trade in the 1930s, it went dramatically down, and as trade was going down, companies were lifting up their trade barriers higher and higher. And the fourth is vast expansion in the regulatory and welfare state. And so it's a little dangerous and dicey situation right now, I think, with trade, because, I'm just going to say one other point. I'm so glad you asked this question, because it's really very topical and very important. Congress is always going to represent the interests of their local districts and their states and so on. That's why we have a Congress, to represent their kind of narrow parochial interests. The president has to be the one who represents the national interest, and that's why the president has to be a free trader. Because the president is not representing Pennsylvania, and he's not representing Ohio. He's representing all the states. And so I think it was a big, both political and economic blunder that Bush did this, unfortunately.
Now, two more.
Sir in the back, yeah.
The campaign finance reform currently in your organization?
This is another kind of funny story. I'm glad you asked this question, because we've been such a blessed organization, the Club for Growth, because I think we're the only organization in Washington that in the last month has been both denounced by Tom Daschle and John McCain, which is wonderful. I mean, the more they denounce us, the better. But because we've been running ads attacking Tom Daschle in South Dakota, but John McCain, for some strange reason, every time he's on TV now, and he's asked why he's doing this bill, he keeps saying it's because we got to put groups like the Club for Growth out of business. And that's because we beat a candidate that he supported in Arizona. We got a guy named Jeff Flake, who's a real up-and-rising star. We helped get elected, and he's never forgiven us for that. In any case, there's three major elements to this campaign finance reform bill. Let me just quickly go over them. Two of them actually would help us, and one of them would hurt us. The first, and something that is good in the bill, is to raise what's called the hard dollar limits. Okay? Now, those hard dollar limits, under current law, any individual contributor can give up to $1,000 to a candidate in an election, and then any individual also has an overall cap. Any individual can give up to $25,000 in hard dollars to candidates. So if somebody wanted to, they could give 25 $1,000 checks to candidates, but then they're done. They can't give any more. This bill would actually raise those hard dollar limits to $2,000 per candidate and $37,500 over the election cycle. That's a good thing to do. And I believe it also indexes it for inflation, because, by the way, when they set this $1,000 limit, which is what, 20 years ago, it would probably be, if we just kept it up with inflation, it would already be $2,000. So it does index it. So that's a positive thing about the bill, because I'm a big believer we should just raise the hard dollar limits. Some people want unlimited, but I'd settle for maybe a $5,000 limit, because if you can do that, then you could do away with PACs and other things. Now, the second thing that this bill does is it gets rid of what's called soft dollars. A lot of people think that means that all soft dollars are banned, but that's not true. What this bill does actually is it just bans soft dollar contributions to the parties. So, for example, people who are now giving $100,000, you know, they've got this Team 100 thing at the Republican National Committee. People would no longer be able to give $100,000 in soft dollars to the Republican National Committee or the Senatorial Committee or the Congressional Committee and so on. And actually that helps us too because we can still take soft dollars. So a lot of those people who were giving $100,000 to the RNC, if they can't give it to the RNC, they're going to look to issue groups to give that money to. And we actually think we would be a beneficiary of that. Now, but the third provision of the bill is really the insidious provision and the thing that is such a blatant violation of the First Amendment, and that is, of course, what's called this advertising ban, which says that within 60 days of an election, you are no longer permitted to, a group like ours could not name a candidate in an advertisement, a radio or TV ad. Look, if that, this is complete incumbency protection. That's what this is about. Because if that law had been in existence for the 2000 election campaign, we would not have been able to lay a glove on Marge Rockema. Because the fact is, the way we really hurt her was we ran ads not 60 days before the election, we ran them 6 days before the election, because most people don't even concentrate on elections until about a week before. And we basically just ran ads saying she's too liberal for the district, all these things. And those kinds of ads really hurt her. Now, if we can't run those kinds of ads, we're not going to be able to hurt. Now, some people, by some interpretations of this advertising ban and naming candidates, you can't even as a citizen write a letter to the editor criticizing your congressman within 60 days of the election. Now, the thing that's so duplicitous about this is that you can't write a letter to the editor criticizing your congressman or woman, but the editors of the newspaper can write an editorial criticizing the congressman. So it gives a huge amount of power to the press, which of course is why the press is so fawning over this bill. So on balance, I think this is a bad piece of legislation. It will weaken the parties, which I don't, even though it will benefit us, I don't think weakening the parties is necessarily a good thing. And I think the advertising ban, which everybody says, oh, this is going to be ruled out of, that the Supreme Court will rule this unconstitutional. I'm not so convinced of that. I mean, I don't want to hinge all my First Amendment rights on these 9 guys on the court right now. So that's sort of my assessment of this bill. Maybe we'll take one more quick question and then we'll wrap it up. Sir.
What is your position on immigration policy and how it's affecting American demographics and the problem of inadequate assimilation?
I've tended to be very pro-immigration, but let me sort of explain what I mean. First of all, there's just no question economically that the United States benefits from being a country of immigration. I mean, if you look at what's happening all across Europe and Japan, they have horrendous problems with respect to population implosion. I mean, those countries have birth rates that are so low today that there's just no way that Japan or France or Italy or Spain can possibly be a global superpower over the next 50 years because they're just not have the people. If you look at, the replacement level fertility is 2.1 children per woman of childbearing age. France today has 1.3. This is like the lowest in recorded history. You project this out in 200 years, there's going to be like 6 Frenchmen left on the globe, which might be a good thing, right? But anyway, so we actually do, I think, benefit from the fact that we're able to import young workers. Now, I happen to believe that when it comes to, you asked this important question about assimilation. I think, when I've talked to the folks on the Hill about immigration, I think that our position should be 3 things. Number one, it should be essentially yes to legal immigration, but no to illegal immigration. That means we need to, secure our borders, and especially in this day and age of, security issues, we need to do a much better job of not just at the borders, but, securing in the homeland to make sure that terrorists aren't getting into the country and so on. So I think that's important to say. We're for legal immigration because that's the reason for 300 years people have been coming here, but we want to tighten up on the border to make sure that people are coming in by the rules. Second of all, I think we ought to have a policy that says yes to immigration, but also yes to assimilation. And one of the problems with a lot of the, ethnic groups is they really view assimilation as a dirty word. And I think Americanization is critical. And in fact, Americanization is not just critical for the country, it's critical for the immigrants themselves, because immigrants who Americanize quickly tend to do much better here in terms of their earnings and so on, that countries than immigrants that don't learn the language and so on. And then I think we ought to say yes to immigration but no to welfare. That is to say, if immigrants want to come here and because they want to work and they want to participate in our freedoms and liberties, absolutely, yes, we want them. But they shouldn't be eligible for welfare programs. They shouldn't be a burden to the taxpayers. And if they do become a burden, it used to be that the law said that if immigrants became a public burden, that they could be deported, and many were. And so I think if we had those kind of three policies, that it would be beneficial to the U.S. with respect to immigration policy. I certainly don't think we should call a timeout on immigration or something like that. I think that would hurt our country more than it would help us. So thank you all very much. I appreciate
Steve, thank you. I knew that you were going to be a hit with this crowd because I know that you have your head screwed on right. And I know that what you are doing, I can't find myself doing anything but applauding your activities now. And while I may have in another hat a partisan affiliation, I recognize the fact that one of the reasons why the left is so efficient within the Democratic Party is that they have this 600-pound gorilla, organized labor, to make discipline for them, but there is no such 600-pound gorilla, but Club for Growth is at least a 350-pound gorilla, and let us hope that it gains another 150 pounds real soon. And thank you for your coming, and let me present to you as a gift and a little token of our appreciation, one of our Silk Adam Smith ties.
Thank you. By the way, one of the things that I was mentioning the other day when people asked about the difference between the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, and it's relevant to this, is that I'm sure you remember this, Morton, but in the Reagan administration, look, we made a lot of mistakes. There's no question about it, but there was definitely an ideology, and one of the things that became very campy in the Reagan years was to wear Adam Smith ties. And in fact, if you went to the White House in the 80s, half of the people in the administration would be wearing these Adam Smith ties. If you go over to the White House today, you're not going to find too many people wearing these. In fact, I brought this up with Karl Rove. It's so funny you gave it. I said, look, where are the Adam Smith ties around here? So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, when they withdraw the tariffs on steel, maybe we can present a tie to somebody over there. Again, thank you all for coming. Remember that we have little trees on offer. If you've got these things, please let Amy Green, my assistant, know about it. We'll make arrangements for you to get the trees. And if you want to bring a shovel and help me dig them up, that